back to Building a Fighter. My name is Dr. Austin Shane, sports chiropractor in Scottsdale, Arizona. With me, as always, badass strength coach in Denver, Colorado, Alex Friedman. Today, we want to talk about why movement is never going to be perfect and there's no use in seeking perfection only. Sometimes you just got to do the work, and sometimes you got to step to the side and let athletes be athletes. Alex, take it away, per usual.
Progress, not perfection,
Yes.
right? So we want to
Let's
progress,
just keep saying different quotes back and forth.
like we
That should be this
not
entire
just not
podcast.
just quotes, cliches,
Yes, exactly. Yes.
cliches. Okay, well, it is what it is when we talk about this.
Nice.
You like that?
Yeah.
Now, honestly, I think a lot of times strength coaches, especially if you get into more of the functional patterning stuff or functional movement or FRC or any of this, we get down such a deep rabbit hole in movement and skill acquisition and biomechanics and anatomy, physiology, all this. We want our athletes to have the same passion for movement and the same skill acquisition that we have for movement, right? And as much as I think that's an integral piece of our job, I don't think we can make that our primary numero uno goal, right?
Right.
We need to address the movement skill as far as makes it safe and effective, but then we ultimately don't need to master something like a kettlebell snatch or a kettlebell swing or something. Like we need to use that and it can be a good tool in our toolbox, but most mixed martial arts fighters or athletes aren't competing with a kettlebell swing, right?
Yeah. I mean, what I would say is it's important to distinctively delineate between something that you're passionate about and then also something that's going to make an athlete better at their sport.
Sure.
Because I feel like a lot of coaches fall into the trap of they want to teach what they're passionate about. Like they took a strong
Hmm.
first course and now they want to teach kettlebell
Sure.
stuff. But if that athlete doesn't give a fuck about learning that skill, it's probably not going to transfer and it's probably not going to go well.
Right.
But also, B, that doesn't necessarily, just because you're passionate about it, does not mean it's going to make them better at what they're trying to train for. Because,
Yeah.
like you said, unless they're training for the Strong First certification, I don't know many people that are going to compete in kettlebell swings.
Right.
Now,
And
I love kettlebell swings, right?
yeah.
Like they're a good movement. But if an athlete just isn't getting them, I don't need to include it in their program. I can switch to something else.
True. Very true. And so that's, I guess, my whole argument here is like at some point we need to um, kind of let go of the skill perfection side of things and gear more towards the um, physical output side or the
Mm-hmm.
outcome or the training effect side of things. So let's you keep using a kettlebell swing, right? Like I want my athlete to be proficient in them. I want them to drive through the hips with a little bit of pop and using a repetitive pattern, and then we get the brace disengage brace pattern that you like for the breathing. Um, we want them to be efficient and effective in that, but then I'm going to only use it in a certain way that trains my athlete for their fight,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'm not going to, start every session with kettlebell swings, or I'm not going to plug it in places where, yeah, I could. Like, yeah, sure, it's a power movement, but are you really creating that much power in a kettlebell swing, right?
I think it
So,
depends on how heavy of a belly you're picking and how honestly how good at the swing they are. Like
yeah,
I got one of my like Bryce Logan's one of my fighters. He's a fucking good kettlebell swinger. He came
sure.
from a gym in the past in South Dakota that was an emphasis of their training was they needed to be good at kettlebell swings because they did a lot of them.
Yeah.
He gets really good fucking power out of a kettlebell swing.
All right.
But if I'm teaching like a fucking 14-year-old wrestler a kettlebell swing, they're probably not getting the same amount of power out of that movement. So while it's good to teach the form, while it's good to teach the technique, while it's good to do all of the things, the thought process behind using the kettlebell swing is sound. I
Yeah.
can probably get better movement and better transfer out of a different movement that I guess that athlete has a little bit more buy into.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where you can get into like your exercise selection type of argument, as far as with this athlete in front of me, are we going to maximize what we can do with a med ball toss? Are we going to do it with a kettlebell swing? Are we going to do it through a squat jump? right?
Mm-hmm.
Like because a lot of your, I don't know, more prototypical like either football player athletes or athletes that have experience in the weight room, they're probably going to value more of like the barbell emphasized stuff or stuff that they see as cool, right? Stuff that they just would prefer to do versus like, hey, why are we playing over here with this dinky kettlebell or what am I supposed to do with this medicine ball? Where, other athletes are more open minded and they want something different or they see a lot of value in the med ball circuits that you do or whatever. So I think you play your exercise selection a little bit to your athletes' personality, and ultimately, it's about what you can get the best training effect from.
Right. Like this is how I feel about like Olympic lifting in general.
Sure.
This is my thought processes on Olympic lifting. Can I teach it? Yes. Do some people like to do it? Yes. If they like to do it, I can walk them through the progressions, but that doesn't mean it's the best exercise for every combat athlete ever. That's just not true.
Yeah.
Like some combat athletes have janky wrists. Some combat athletes can't catch without dipping into hyperextension. Some combat athletes have both of those, as we
Mm,
watch Alex roll out his wrists and think about his
yeah.
low back right there. But like it's a good exercise for certain people, but it's not necessarily a good exercise for all people. And just because
Mm-hmm.
I did my USAW level 1 cert and I'm all passionate about it right now doesn't mean that every single athlete I work with needs to do this thing. Like I actually see this a lot with people that get taught by somebody that's a CrossFit coach
Yeah.
and they do handstand push-ups. Like any sort of handstand maneuver, this is where I see the carryover doesn't necessarily make sense. I'm not a huge handstand push-up guy. I don't
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's a whole lot of application personally for it.
I don't think there's a whole lot of athletes that can do it safely and effectively.
Right. But that's what I'm saying. Some people can though. And for
Sure.
those athletes that can do it, that's a great thing. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not necessarily the exercise is bad, but making something complex or making something hard just because you're passionate about that movement, you think that handstand push-ups are going to do well, doesn't mean that that athlete in front of you is going to get any transfer in skill or any transfer of sport
Yeah.
to MMA or to jujitsu or to wrestling. It's just going to make them work hard. And that's literally the same as me just having them do like sprints with little rest. That, in my
Yeah.
mind, doing
Yeah.
handstand push up without proper form is the same as having somebody do sprint work without any rest. It's probably just a waste of your time and you're probably just getting tired.
Yeah. You're just working hard to get tired. Yeah. But I think, too, like we can remove passion from the situation as well. Like maybe it's not even something you're passionate about, but it's like one of the only tools in your toolbox, right?
True.
If I think
Yeah.
about,
Maybe you
if
just
I
have a
think,
limited toolbox.
right, that's true too. Because I think if I think about like power, and maybe I've come from our prototypical collegiate setting gym is like, well, I've only seen plyometrics and only box jumps develop power, so we can only do that, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
you're missing a piece of the puzzle, especially in an MMA landscape, right? Like box jumps can absolutely increase overall power, but is that going to be the most specific thing that we can emphasize? Is that going to be the best thing for an athlete that's like terribly afraid to hit their shins on the box, right? Like if that's an impediment in itself, like we can do work to get over it, sure, if you want to, but why not just change?
Right.
Why
Why
not
don't you
just go
just
like,
jump without the box and actually
or
learn how to catch at the bottom of it?
yeah, or
Crazy.
throw a med ball or
Yeah.
do or
Do a
like
sky throw,
overhead,
which is
yeah.
basically the exact same movement.
So again, there's multiple options there, and I think um, I don't know. I think a lot of trainers do their due diligence as far as looking up exercise variability, but I see a lot of trainers that just stay in their box too.
Well, it's funny what you were saying is like, what if the athlete, like, what if they're afraid of hitting their shins? So we learn in sports medicine, like, literally, I think the first lesson of my first sports med course was the number one reason to hold an athlete out of competition or out of doing something is if they don't think they're ready for it. And
Yeah,
typically we're talking about injury, right? It's if they don't trust their body to go complete the goal in front of them or to go compete in their sport at a higher level, they shouldn't be competing in that sport. It's the
yeah,
same thing with picking a fucking exercise. If that athlete is afraid of hitting their fucking shin on a box, guess what? Either you start way lower to where they feel comfortable or you just don't do that fucking exercise,
yeah,
right? Because it's not mandatory for them to be able to step into the cage at 100%. It's really
yeah,
not. There's a bunch of different ways to accomplish the same goal. But also, like, I want to talk about like the sports med side of things too, because I see I see my fellow compatriots, the people that are in sports med, are probably the reason why this perfect movement thing started in the first place.
It's your
Is
fault. It's all your fault.
and that's typically how it is.
As long
But
as you know.
there's there's people in sports med that they love correctives, like Alex had mentioned, functional patterns or FRC or all these different things. And while these movements are great, and I use a lot of the different strategies of movements, if all you ever do is focus on trying to get good or be perfect at FRC movements, that doesn't necessarily have a high translation into your sport.
Yeah.
What it is going to do is it's going to force you to become so introspective on and internally focused on everything you're doing and making the joint angle perfect, being able to contract the right muscle going through the movements, being fluid as you go. That's all you're going to be thinking about instead of, hey, punch this fucker in front of me, right? And it's this thing called rehab purgatory,
Yeah.
where there's people that are rehab professionals that keep finding things wrong with the athlete in front of them that aren't quote unquote perfect and trying to fix them, when in reality they don't need to be fixed in the first place. It's not going to have any translation, or if it is, it's a very minor one into their competition or into their skill set. It's just they saw something that looked faulty and they want to fix that thing, when in reality you need to learn or you need to know you might not need to fix that thing. That doesn't have to be 100% perfect. 92% is okay. That's still a fucking A.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but I mean, especially in mixed martial arts, are a gold mine of like if you keep digging, you're gonna keep
Bro,
finding shit
any
that's fucked
person
up, dude.
on earth, I can run through a screen and I can pick up something wrong with you.
Yeah,
Every single person on earth.
probably
That
multiple
doesn't mean
things.
I do that.
Right. And then there's progressions to run through, and then there's movement patterns to address versus specific acute injuries. There's just the goal is not, again, we're going to cliche it up. The goal is not perfect. The goal is to progress and get to a place that's functional, right? We can look at
Mhm.
it rather than, perfect movement or not perfect movement. We can look at it as functional for your performance or dysfunctional, right? Can you do your job? Can you not do your job? Right. And so we want to get this person to a place where they're functional and reliably functional,
Mhm.
not on and off dysfunctional.
Right. Like I feel as though like the primal movement patterns, those should be good. Those, they don't have to be perfect and they're never going to be perfect, but those should be in a high level of emphasis. That's going to be squat, hinge, push, pull, carry, lunge, anti-rotate, rotate. Those are mine in my head. So those should be relatively sound, and you should be able to do those because those are the building blocks of all of the exercises that you do in strength and conditioning. But again, everybody rotates different. Everybody lunges different. Everybody's hips are your ball and socket joint of your hips are made different than the other person standing across from you. So you might have to lunge a little bit differently. If we're looking for
Yeah.
quote unquote perfect is going to be a scale up and down. You need to be able to understand that as a coach and not try to fix something. Maybe that person's got really long legs. Well,
Yeah.
really long legs are more prone to being a little bit more wobbly when you're stepping out in a lunge, right? They're
Mm,
not going to be as stable as those little short tree trunks.
yeah.
Guess what? You need to understand that. And if they end up in the right position, as long as it's not a massive valgus collapse, it's okay. It's not going to hurt them.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely an acceptable bandwidth, acceptable range within movement, but I think I want to shift to more of the training effect, performance outcome side of this, right? Because that's the other half of this kind of equation or topic that we put on the board is like quit chasing the perfect movement, quit training like the movement or skill acquisition of the movement. That's certainly a piece, and there's definitely a necessity for that, but there's a bandwidth of acceptable technique. Now, what we actually need to be doing is training the performance effect, the training effect,
Mm-hmm.
right? We got to actually up our outputs in whatever we've identified as our key performance indicators.
Yep.
So I think when we kind of switch that mode, depending on timing, depending on ability, depending on a multitude of factors, right? Where your fighter is in their camp or out of camp, when you make that change, we start to get a little more extrinsic and we're not picking exercises that necessarily accomplish a movement skill, right? We're going to start
Hmm.
picking exercises that your athlete can get the most out of, that can perform the best, right? Like,
And what makes
let's,
them feel good.
yeah, exactly. So let's say we've been on a trap bar deadlift, right? Like, all right, my athlete is proficient at a trap bar deadlift. If we're getting into this like performance outcome thing, it's not time to switch. Hey, all right, let's 3 rep maximum on the back squat, right? Like, doesn't make sense, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
let's continue this progression through the trap bar deadlift and see what output they can put. And like, let's say they, trap bar deadlift 405 pounds. Like, sick. That's awesome. That's not only proficiency in the skill, but that's also a gain in absolute strength.
Hmm.
So I think that's where I draw the line, or that's where I try and look at what's the best exercise to get the outcome that I'm chasing, not just what's the best exercise to solve this kind of movement puzzle in front of me.
Yeah. And I mean that's a really good fucking way to think about it, because I've been in situations before where I've wanted to add in something different at the end
Yeah,
of a camp just because it might be in my mind it might be a better exercise, right?
sure.
I think it might fit where we are
And it
in a
very well
better
may have.
way.
And it very
Yeah,
well may have.
exactly. But I always have to reel myself back in when I'm writing up the program, and I'm like, hey, motherfucker, you just had them do a trap bar deadlift. You had them do B stance trap bar deadlift. You had them go from B stance trap bar deadlift into like a trap bar ISO hold. Why in the fuck are you switching into some sort of Zercher movement?
Right.
Stick with a goddamn trap bar
Yeah.
and go to a jump or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And that's where you have to, like, I'm guilty of it too, where I immediately think like, what's the best exercise for this situation, not what's the best exercise for this athlete for the situation. And
Right.
that's where you need to get to, and that's where I've personally, I felt like I've turned the corner within the last year, where it's not just what's the best thing for the make to make the best program possible, it's how do I make the best program possible for the person in front of me,
Amen.
especially in the semi-private to private model, which I'm in. That's what matters the most. If you're working with a team sport, it probably matters a little bit less, because like, no matter what, you're not going to make everybody happy.
Yeah, you
Like,
can't be super individualized.
if everybody's on one program, there's always going to be some tall gangly motherfucker that's not going to like the lifts that you're doing. Or if your program is based towards tall gangly motherfuckers, the short little pit bull is going to hate what you're doing no matter
Right.
what.
Yeah. And there's individual concessions that need to happen there, but like cliche number 3 is like get out of your own way,
Yeah.
right? Like it's not about you. When you're writing a program, like and it's a weird thing that we do as strength coaches because we study the programming side, the exercise selection and like biomechanics and exercise technique and this, and when we get so in depth on all of that technical stuff, we almost forget about the person that's going to be executing this exercise. So it's like when I look at a program, like you need to look at the name and think of the person behind the program more, I think, than typical, right? Because all the time writing a program, it's like, a hinge would fit perfectly here. All right, we did we've been doing, let's say, RDLs with the barbell. Okay, but this person always tells me their low back hurts when we do RDLs with the barbell, but the
Hmm.
hinge goes really well there. So it's like, okay, let's modify a hinge, right?
Yep.
Let's change how we're going to do that. Maybe go with kettlebells, maybe relearn it against the wall, maybe make it a single leg or maybe
Do it on a
stagger
GHD.
stances.
Just change the
Sure.
way you're doing it. Yeah.
Exactly. So the personalization aspect I think is super important to get your outcome. And then the next layer to that is if a person's proficient and we've trained them in a certain like not movement pattern but a certain exercise pattern,
Hmm.
that's the one we're going to get the most output from,
Yep.
right? Something that they're proficient and confident in, regardless of like applicability, I think is going to give you a better outcome because they'll be more confident in it. They'll be able to do it at a higher like RPM, right?
Hmm.
And then that's going to create more of a training effect than even this like perfect idealized exercise that you can have in your head.
100%. Like, I've in my mind recently, I've been thinking about it as like a Venn diagram, where there's confidence exercises on the right, on
Mm-hmm.
the left, competency, and I need it to be right in the middle. I need it to be the middle, the
Yeah.
intersection of the two circles is confident in the exercise and done it before, competency through movement patterns, put it right in the middle for that individual athlete, that's going to be your
I like
best
that.
benefit in a program right there. And
Yeah.
any exercise that falls into middle of that should be in that athlete's program in season, and
Yeah.
definitely 1000% definitely should be in their peaking phases, because if they
Yeah.
feel confident and they're really fucking good at it, there's no reason not to include it
Yeah.
in a base or a main part of their program, because that's
Yeah.
going to make them feel like Superman. That's that superpower we talk about all the time.
Right.
It's those are the exercises, if they're good at them and they feel good doing them, that make them feel like Superman.
Yeah. Absolutely. And on top of that, the time to add new skills in is like an off camp or add something new to their program. But you got to stick with your exercise selection for a while. Like I've been more and more recently on a reps kick, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the way you get better at something is you practice it and you do it for volume, right? Like
Yep.
I think there are ways to short that, but the more reps you get at something, the better and more proficient you're going to become at it, right? So if we start it in the off season and we give it, I wouldn't even say 4 weeks or one program or a month is enough time to master something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if I'm going to choose this major exercise, I'm sticking with this for a good hearty 6 months,
Right.
unless we get
But
a short notice, whatever. But
right.
I want to stick with this because then we're going to get more and more and more and more proficient at it. And then that adds to our Venn diagram, adds to an exercise that we can select come peaking time, which may suit this athlete better.
But Alex, that's so boring from an athlete's perspective.
I know, I know.
But I'm joking with you, but
But
that's a
it's true.
legitimate
You
concern.
get
Like
that a lot.
when we write programs, we're like, oh, we did that last month, the last 2 months. We can't do that same exercise. So there has to
Uh,
be a give and a take, right?
yeah,
There has to be a repartee, if you will, a back and a forth.
I'm not
And
impressed by that word.
I was.
You were looking for approval, and I'm not
No,
getting
I
it
was
from
looking for you to say like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" Because I don't think I used it right. But,
you. True.
but
Uh,
you need to be able to have that back and forth, and you need to be able to communicate with the athlete. Like, there's a reason why we're picking the same movement over and over and over again. It's because
yeah,
we've identified that as a key performance indicator for you.
yeah,
That movement in general is going to have the highest transfer over into you benefiting in your
yeah.
sport. And as long as they know that, typically they're a little bit more on board.
Absolutely, and I think that's a big part of the job, and it's better than like buy-in or better than trying to like convince somebody and persuade them of your knowledge set is like creating value, right? Like I feel like as a strength and conditioning coach, this whole like athlete coach relationship goes smoother when you create value in the work that you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
which is harder to do in a group setting, right? Like, if we're doing sled pushes and um maybe my athlete is super, like let's say we're doing lactic power sled pushes, right? My athlete's
Mm-hmm.
super good at that, and they look at me and it's like, why am I doing this? I was like, well, it's for lactic power. One, what the fuck does that mean?
What the
Right.
fuck is what is lactic acid is always what I get. When I say
Right.
lactic power, they're like, "Oh, lactic acid?" I'm like, "Kinda. Keep
Right. So
going."
first, what is that? Second, oh, but I'm already good at this, I'm not even tired, why am I doing it? And three is like, shouldn't I be doing something different? Right.
Yeah.
So that's not adding value to the situation. Adding value to the situation could be something like, well, this is going to help you scramble a little bit harder when you're in your wrestling goes, or this is
Mm-hmm.
something that's going to help your legs prevent from dying or being super fatigued after you get up off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like create value and tell your athlete where this is going to be applicable, speak their language for sort. But I don't know how I got off on that tangent, but
Well, no,
that's where I went there.
what's funny is because I think that's a good tangent to be on, because energy system work is typically where I find this the most. Like if we're
Yeah,
doing like explosive repeat circuit, and you have to go all the way through the progressions and you have to do a fuck ton of them. Like I'm talking like 2 series of 8 sets sometimes, where you're
yeah,
doing a lot of the same exercise to get the stimulus you're trying to go after. You have to relay the message of, this is going to be boring today, I'm sorry,
yeah.
but this is what's going to make you better, and this is what we're trying to go after.
Yeah. And I think creating value behind rest in that sense as well too, because specifically strength training, right? Like, oh, I gotta wait between sets. This is so boring. I'm not getting a sweat in, or
Yeah.
like, or even when I do like alactic sprints on the bike, like And electric sprints get a little hard after like four, five,
Yep.
maybe six of them. But some athletes that don't have that electric burst are it's hard to access for them. They're like, this is so easy. Why
Yeah.
the fuck? Why do I get 50 seconds rest?
It's because you're bad at it, homie.
Right. So you got to tell them that first off, but then you got to create the value of like, here's why we do the rest, and we just
Yeah.
really need to get better at producing quick uh, power in that
Yeah.
sense. So yeah, adding value to your work will help your athlete understand the work, which somehow translates back to the topic of this podcast.
Movement isn't perfect. I don't know
Okay.
how
Yeah.
that transfers
Focus on
back.
outcomes.
Yeah.
Focus on outcomes. There you go. We're looking for an alactic adaptation, and this is more of an outcome based. We don't necessarily need to worry about can you do it perfectly, but you have to do it adequately.
All right. Well, before we get more off topic, that is our podcast on movement isn't always perfect. If you guys got to get in touch with us, all of our information is in the show notes. That's going to be emails and Instagrams. You can also hit us up at buildingafighter.com. We have strength and conditioning programs over there. We have memberships available for you, all preset, ready to go, as well as custom programs available at your disposal. So, all you wrestlers that are coming out of high school and college season and going into the off season, that's where we shine because you actually get to focus on what you need to do and not just focus on wrestling the entire time
Yeah.
and making weight every week. Now we
Yeah.
get to get stronger. Now we get to get faster. Now we get to get more mobile. I would argue that strength and conditioning is way more important out of season for wrestlers than in season. So hit those up at buildingafighter.com. This is Dr. Austin Shane,
Alex Friedman.
and we are out.
Bing, 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 bing. Bing, bing, bing.
He sounded like Peter Griffin from Family Guy there.
Bing, bing.